when the poison of the far right leads to serious threats to Jess Phillips and others, then in my book, a line has been crossed.
After about a week of ignoring them, the Prime Minister Keir Starmer finally has responded to Elon Musk's endless tweets criticising him for his response to child sexual abuse. We'll discuss what's going on and what else is happening in British and global politics on this episode of Newscast, the BBC's daily news podcast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio at Westminster.
And it's Chris in the Newscast studio at Westminster.
Happy New Year.
And to you.
Although some of us have been doing newscasts since last week.
Oh, have you? Oh, well, I admire your indefatigability.
Indefatigability is one of George Galloway's favourite words. Anyway, If anyone deserved a break of 2 weeks, it is you.
Thank you.
And in a minute, we're going to be joined by Stephen Kinnock, who's one of the health ministers, because Keir Starmer had a big speech today, although they were actually billed as remarks rather than a speech, about how the government is actually going to clamp down on the NHS backlog. Having sort of set a target and an aspiration to do it, we're now getting a bit more detail about how they will do it.
I reckon when the Prime Minister talks for less than 15 minutes, they call it remarks. And if it's longer than that, they can call it a speech.
Okay.
And nobody's ever said that officially. That's my kind of rough
Chris
rough
Mason
gist of it.
rule.
Yeah.
Right. First of all, though, we've got to talk about this. I mean, it's basically an onslaught on social media aimed at Keir Starmer from Elon Musk, who is the richest man in the world, one of the closest kind of Svengalis of the incoming US President, Donald Trump, and until, yesterday, looked like he was going to be supporting Reform UK. So, okay, he's only two of those things now because he's had this big falling out with Nigel Farage. What's your take on just what's been coming Keir Starmer's way from Elon Musk?
I think it's worth taking a couple of steps back, isn't it? Because not that long ago, in the danger of sounding very sort of middle-aged now, but not that long ago, prior to the development of social media, there wouldn't really have been the opportunity for someone, however rich and however well-connected, to have this real-time volley of kind of digital darts coming across the Atlantic, going for a government. And yet here you have Elon Musk, all of the things that you describe him as well as the owner of X and somebody who loves tapping out messages on X, with a extraordinary frequency of messages of not
every couple of minutes.
Yeah, not mild criticism, but criticism in the bluntest and crudest of terms, often which doesn't demonstrate much of a sense of the nuances of British politics, to put it gently, and gunning for the integrity, the capability, the competence of the Prime Minister. And that's before you get into all of the stuff, as you say, about reform and Nigel Farage and all of that. And the incredible thing, I was talking to somebody in politics about this earlier today, that here you have this guy who is one of the most extraordinary entrepreneurs of his age and perhaps of all time, with the attention to detail that must have required around electric cars, around rockets, around goodness knows what, who, when it comes to tapping stuff out on social media, is more willing to throw quite a bit of caution to the wind. And with that, forced the Prime Minister into a situation where he kind of had to respond. I was talking to people over the weekend in government, and they thought, well, we've got to take this on.
Well, because up until that point, they sort of didn't want to give it the oxygen of publicity. They didn't want to dignify it.
And it's not new, of course. You know, Elon Musk has been sounding off about Keir Starmer and this government pretty much since they took office. But the frequency has gone through the ceiling in the last couple of weeks, and in particular the last couple of days, around this whole business of child sexual exploitation and whether or not Keir Starmer, when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, was doing enough, whether the government is somehow part of a quote-unquote cover-up because it won't have a full public inquiry. So the Prime Minister concluded he had to respond. And I think what was, noticeable, striking about that response was that it was angry, it was passionate. It was quite a lot of the things that critics of Keir Starmer often accuse him of not being in public.
Well, do you know what? Let's hear it now. And just in terms of the choreography of how this happened, the PM was doing his remarks about the NHS. Then he opened it up to questions from the media. He took the first question from friend of Newscast, Hugh Pym at the BBC, our health editor. And Hugh Pym asked him a question about Elon Musk, which he sort of dodged in a sort of semi-diplomatic way. And then it was when Beth Rigby from Sky said, look, I'm sorry, you need to just address this. And he gave quite a long answer that included his backstory, his record, and then his take on what Elon Musk had been doing in the last few days.
Those that are spreading lies and misinformation as far and as wide as possible, they're not interested in victims. They're interested in themselves. Those who are cheerleading Tommy Robinson, not interested in justice. They're supporting a man who went to prison for nearly collapsing a grooming case, a gang grooming case. These are people who are trying to get some kind of vicarious thrill from street violence that people like Tommy Robinson promote. And those attacking Jess Phillips, who I'm proud to call a colleague and a friend, not protecting victims. Jess Phillips has done 1,000 times more than they've even dreamt about when it comes to protecting victims of sexual abuse throughout her entire career.
And then that opened up a domestic can of worms because then on Monday afternoon, you got Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the Conservatives, the leader of the opposition, saying, hang on, don't smear me as a member of the, quote, far right, just because I, Kemi Badenoch, have been asking for a new inquiry into all these child sexual abuse scandals in places like Rochdale and Oldham.
Yeah, no, completely. And the Conservatives are really sort of doubling down on that. So as we record at 6:30 on Monday night, there's a statement going on in the House of Commons. Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, Chris Philp, her shadow, and Chris Philp making that point again, suggesting that was a big mistake for Keir Starmer to talk about amplifying the far right. It was interesting that the Prime Minister clearly wanted to be pretty robust about Elon Musk whilst barely referring to him directly, and equally not wanting to start sort of transatlantic mudslinging. But if the mud's all coming in one direction across the Atlantic, you get to the point where you've got to throw a little bit of it back, whilst also then trying to turn it onto the Conservatives, because he's making an argument that not only did he pursue this as Director of Public Prosecutions, but that there was a national inquiry, not a public inquiry, but a national inquiry conducted into all of this that made a lot of recommendations a couple of years ago and that they've not been implemented. So try and turn the attention onto the Conservatives. And of course, part of all of this row relates to Stephen Yaxley-Lennon, the guy who calls himself Tommy Robinson, who's currently in prison for contempt of court, and where you've had an argument involving him and Nigel Farage, and an argument from some, including Mr. Yaxley-Lennon, who is widely seen to be on the far right, saying that much more has to be done about this, that there has been a cover-up, that collectively society didn't do enough to address it.
What is so difficult about this story is just being able to say things that are definitive. So, for example, you can have the Conservatives saying we need a statutory inquiry into these horrible cases of children being raped and abused on a big scale, but there has already been an inquiry. It's just it wasn't specifically into that. It covered that a bit, but not maybe in as much depth as you would get if you did it on its own. So kind of both those things are true at the same time. Then you get the fact that Yvette Cooper, in her statement that she's just been giving, that you're referring to now, is talking about implementing one of the recommendations of that inquiry, which is making it mandatory that if you work with children and you get a report of potential child abuse, you have to follow it up and report it. And it would now be a crime if you don't do that. The government's going to introduce that in some legislation next week. But then Chris Philp was saying, well, hang on, the previous government had started the process of introducing that in the last parliament. They just didn't get around to actually doing it because there was an election. So both those things are kind of true at the same time as well. And then I went on X today and I was looking at some of the tweets that are critical of Keir Starmer from other people. And you know, X has now got this AI bot attached to it called Grok. And so on some tweets, you get a little label at the bottom provided by Grok where you can click on it. And one of the labels under this tweet was, why is this a problem for the left? And you click on it and then Grok sucks up all sorts of things from the internet and then gives you a quite compelling argument about why Keir Starmer might be in the wrong. And it looks quite authoritative, but it is from a particular point of view. It's not balanced. It's trying to demonstrate to you why it's a problem for Keir Starmer. But then if you click on a different label for Grok on the same tweet, you then get a list of things that Keir Starmer has done to deal with crime and child sexual exploitation, which makes him look quite good because it's from different sources. And so you're just like clicking on this going, well, what's true?
Yeah, and underlying all of that.
Sorry, I sounded a bit frustrated there, but it's been quite a head-scratching afternoon for me.
No, it has, and I think part of it there's a head and heart thing at the heart of all of this, which is that, yes, the Prime Minister can point to the national inquiry that was done, the local inquiries that were done, what they're seeking to do in government. The Conservatives can say that they tried to get some of those balls rolling and then ran out of time. There's a perception thing, which I think is what's given space for Elon Musk and Nigel Farage and Kerry Badenoch to make an argument that they've made around a public inquiry, that whatever has happened, is there a gap between society's collective reaction to these abhorrent crimes and the scale of the crimes? And there's a perception that there is a gap there, that somehow there wasn't enough significance, importance, a sense of collective horror that matched the scale of it. One tiny little example, but it kind of illustrates it, is that when the report, the national report that we're talking about, done by Professor Alexis Jay, was published, that came out in October of 2022. What were the likes of you and me talking about in October 2022? We were talking about a government collapsing. We were talking about Liz Truss's government collapsing. Now, of course we were, because if a government collapses, that makes a lot of news, but there's an opportunity cost to that, which means other stuff doesn't get reported. So that report, I was looking back at our cuttings, digital cuttings. Tom Simons, our Home Affairs correspondent.
Listening to old newscasts.
Yeah, no, exactly. There was an extensive piece that he wrote on the day that Alexis Jay's report came out, and here are these recommendations and all the rest of it. Did it pass me by at the time? Well, yeah, it did. Will it pass millions of people by at the time? Yes, it will have done. That's a tiny little example in the grand scheme of things, but I think it gets to a sense that there might just be a gap, as some people see it, between the scale of these crimes and society's response. And into that has come this debate about the question of, do we need a public inquiry?
And it's interesting when you talk about things that kind of just pass us by in terms of the daily news, because I'm thinking back to an episode of Newsnight I did before Christmas, which was the day that the father of Sarah Sharif got sentenced and for murdering her and torturing her in a horrible, horrible way. And I was interviewing the Children's Commissioner, Rachel D'Souza, and she very passionately said, I've been fighting for years now for each child in the UK to have an own unique identifier number, so that police, social services, the healthcare system, schools know what child they're talking about when someone's at risk. And it now looks like the government's going to do that. So that's an example of actually the system getting better in response to some terrible crimes being committed. But because it's quite technocratic and there's lots of other things happening, maybe people won't notice that it's being addressed. Just one other thought. I thought that, so later this week there's going to be a debate in Parliament and on some legislation, and the Conservatives are going to put an amendment forward calling for the statutory inquiry into this child sexual abuse cases that they've been talking about. And I just wonder, that's going to be quite a tricky spot for MPs, because Labour MPs will probably be told to not vote for that. It might not even get selected for a vote. But then maybe the Conservatives will criticise Labour MPs for not supporting it, and that could raise the temperature again. Yeah. And then you'll have Labour MPs being accused of being the child abusers' friends because they haven't supported. So there's a potential for this to get very, very, very heated.
Yeah, and particularly for those MPs where you're representing a town where this might have been a really significant local issue, and one that is still a really live concern in terms of a sense of injustice. And then to take a step back from the specifics of the sort of depravity around this particular issue is, as you were saying when we started the conversation, the Elon Musk question. So today we've had Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, talking about what he sees as the unjustified interference of Elon Musk in other countries' politics. And the president of France was talking about Germany, where Elon Musk has had a thing or two to say about their forthcoming election. How do we in the 2020s wrestle with, and how do governments wrestle with, people of significant clout with big platforms, as some see it, meddling in the politics of other countries?
And also,
fascinating.
And also the EU have got a big and very powerful new piece of legislation to clamp down on things that they perceive as misinformation or disinformation or online harms. And so will this be the moment in which Europe pulls a big lever that leads to X being switched off?
Well, because at the crux of this, you've got Elon Musk and others using two words to justify what they're doing, free and speech. And then you've got Keir Starmer today talking about truth. Hang on a minute, isn't truth the bedrock from which you build any political debate? And taking issue with some of those, extraordinary language that Elon Musk has used about Keir Starmer, and simply saying, look, that is simply not true. Now, that's separate from a legitimate political argument you might have about whether or not there's a public inquiry. But some of the things that Elon Musk has said specifically about Keir Starmer or about Jess Phillips, the safeguarding minister, and then the role of the likes of us in reporting it, in an argument that Keir Starmer was making about amplifying untruth, even in aspects of the kind of, if you like, however you want to describe what we do, media. Legacy media is the often pejorative term, isn't it?
Or the MSM.
Oh, indeed. What role do we have in reporting that, but doing it in a responsible way that draws a line between truth and fiction?
Well, yeah, because Elon Musk's tweets, if they carry on like this and of a similar ilk, will be less newsworthy because they'll just be what he does every day.
Yes,
So
yes, and in
therefore-
that sense, perhaps will decline in kind of relevance or news value, even if they are getting a trillion or a million or a gazillion views / retweets / whatever, because of his, whatever it is, 211 million followers.
On a totally different note, Justin Trudeau is going to step down as Prime Minister of Canada, which kind of surprises me because I feel the word embattled has been attached to him for about 2, 3, 4 years now. So I'm quite surprised he's lasted this long.
Yeah.
But that says more about the Canadian parliamentary system than about his
the
popularity.
thing with Justin Trudeau, so when I first took on this job sort of 2.5 years ago, I remember going to a G7 summit in the Bavarian Alps, and we were in this Schloss, this castle. It's my one word of German vocabulary. waiting to interview Boris Johnson, and down below us, it was an extraordinary backdrop with the mountains, kind of rocky, craggy mountains, and then below us, all of the leaders were like milling round in the garden of this hotel, and some are mooching around, some are jogging. It's all slightly performative because they know they're kind of in public, and Justin Trudeau was wandering round with the sort of air of a guy who kind of just knew what he was doing because he's just been around for ages. 9 years. 9 years is quite something when we're used to in British politics. I mean,
We haven't had a Prime Minister in the place for that long
9
for a
months.
long time.
9 months has been quite good going for British Prime Ministers recently. Keir Starmer's not made that yet, and Liz Truss clearly never did, and okay, Rishi Sunak did, but not by much, etc., etc. So that kind of, he gave off that, as I say, that kind of air of a semi-permanence, but all comes to an end eventually.
Well, and for him, it was the two I's: inflation, which lots of people have had to deal with, but he's actually was fatally wounded by it, and immigration. And even in a country as welcoming as Canada, happy to have people from all over the world come and settle there. Once it really starts hitting people's house prices or the cost of living, then it doesn't matter how open-armed and open-hearted a country is. They want immigration to be clamped down on, and he had to do some massive clamping down on immigration last year.
It's so interesting listening to Sarah Smith, our North America editor. Our North America editor reporting on a country in North America other than America, which doesn't happen all that often. But where the argument, beyond the specifics of Canada and Trudeau, you could be reporting on almost any Western democracy in terms of what has done for incumbent governments.
Now, talking of politicians who are related to famous fathers who were in politics, perfect cue for Stephen Kinnock, the health minister. Stephen, hello.
Hello. Good
We were
evening.
just talking about the end of the Trudeau dynasty, but it's good to see the Kinnock dynasty is still going strong.
Oh, I don't know about that. But, so that was interesting news today, wasn't it?
Yeah. Right, let's talk about your news about cutting the NHS backlog. So the target is... I can't remember. What is the target now? Because it's got a lot of numbers in it.
The target is that by the end of the Parliament, we will return to the standard that 92% of the people who get referred, the gap between from referral to treatment should be 18 weeks or less. It currently stands at 59%. We want within a year to be getting to 65%, and by the end of the Parliament to 92%.
And how are you going to do it?
So, a range of very practical and tangible measures. Some examples: getting the app to work far more effectively, so people are getting information rapidly about their diagnosis and are able to operate the app in terms of making appointments far more effectively. Paying GPs to do much more work around referring to specialists, but using opportunities to treat people in the community rather than just putting them straight into secondary care, into hospitals.
Why have you got to pay MPs to do that? The other Ps. Why have you got to pay GPs to do that? Shouldn't they be doing that anyway?
Well, there needs to be some better incentives in the system, because at the moment it isn't working as effectively as it should. So we are actually using some of the budget that we set aside for electives reform to support GPs, to incentivise them to do this advice and guidance, it's called in the jargon, far more effectively.
To pay them more?
Yeah, £20 per. When you make an advice and guidance decision to refer people to treatment in the community rather than referring them for treatment in a hospital, you will keep them. It keeps them out of where the pressure really is in the system in terms of the backlogs, and it will deliver in terms of our big strategic shift from hospital to community.
Isn't there something a bit odd in that shouldn't GPs be making a decision on the basis of the clinical need of the patient rather than trousering 20 quid?
Well, I think the challenge we have is that the system as it stands isn't working. GPs who are under massive pressure are not always making those community referrals. We think that in order to shift the system, you've got to put some incentives into it. And, we're not ideological about this. We are hard-headed pragmatists who, just as we've said around harnessing the independent sector to do 1 million new appointments, additional appointments in gynecology, orthopaedics and ear, nose and throat, which make up a very large part of the backlog. We're not ideological, we're pragmatic. We believe in levelling the playing field so that working people can get the appointments that others who might have more financial resources than them are using to jump the queue.
I remember the first piece I ever did for the Daily Politics programme was actually about all the little payments that GPs get for delivering services, because actually general practice is a lot more complicated and a lot more kind of like money driven than you might think when you go in and get your appointment for free. You said working people. I noticed in the press release that attaches to all these reforms, Wes Streeting talks over and over again about working class people and their access to the NHS. Is that not a bit of kind of, I don't want to say it's class warfare, but I thought the NHS is for everyone. Does he say the phrase working class people like 3 or 4 times?
Look, one of the founding principles of the NHS is that your treatment should be based on need and not on your ability to pay. I think if we're honest, over the last 14 years, we have seen the development of a 2-tier system whereby those who can afford to go private are going private. They're getting the interventions that they need far more rapidly. They're getting the service that they need, the access that they need far more quickly. That needs to stop. We need to have an NHS that is for everyone, regardless of your financial resources. We want to put an end to the 2-tier system. So it's got to be free at the point of delivery, and the playing field has to be levelled. So that means the NHS is now striking a partnership. We're doing a deal with the independent sector whereby we will support the measures that are needed to focus on orthopaedics, ear, nose and throat and gynecology, so that also the independent sector isn't cherry-picking what it wants to do and it's entirely driven by the people out there who've got the financial resources to make it happen. We're actually having systemic reform, and we're doing that in partnership with the independent sector.
And you also talk, I mean, there's a bit of incentives here as well, because you talk about making sure it's the private sector gets rewarded fairly for taking on some of the burden of the backlog while it's still being free for the patient. But you also talk about rewarding the services that clear the backlog fastest. So would you be happy with a world where actually the NHS provided like pure public sector provision just goes down and down and down and down, and the private sector goes up and up and up and up and up, and eventually there's some things that maybe are all provided by the private sector?
I think there's a really important nuanced difference to what you've just said there, Adam, which is that we will be looking at improvements. So the trusts that are delivering the greatest improvements will receive additional funding, but improvements can come from a very low base.
Right.
So it's not actually about saying these are all the ones that are performing really well, and sometimes they're performing well because of the socioeconomic community that they're serving has got better health outcomes anyway for all sorts of reasons. We're actually saying even those who might now be underperforming or doing worse than other parts of the country, we want to see marked improvement. They may not be getting up to the level of the best, but they are making clear improvements. They will also be rewarded in the system that we're bringing forward, particularly around capital incentives.
The crux of all of this, if we take half a step back, I've been struck that...
Just half a step.
Well, maybe 4 or 5 steps back, I don't know. Maybe
It's like the difference between a speech and remarks.
yeah. You know, for all the commentary that there's been in the last few months around, you know, how you guys have got going in government 6 months in, etc., opinion polls, how difficult, arguably, it is to govern in the 2020s. I was struck listening to the Prime Minister earlier on. Obviously, there was all of those questions about Elon Musk and all the rest of it. But when there's so many people on waiting lists, actually delivering on this stuff, that is absolutely key, isn't it? I mean, it's key for millions of people. That's what really matters. But politically, it's really key for you guys. If in a few years' time you can point to delivering on this stuff, that's going to be far bigger than the usual daily noises of politics as to whether or not you guys get a second term or not.
I totally agree with that, Chris. And you know, the fact is there is a lot of scepticism and cynicism out there, and I think we've had, you know, the last 14 years, whatever your political views, it's been turbulent, it's been messy, and a lot of promises have been made and not kept. And you combine that with all sorts of other issues, you know, the long tail of the financial crash, the promises that were made around Brexit. You know, I don't think many of those have really materialised in terms of the sunlit uplands that were promised. So there's a lot of cynicism and scepticism out there. And our passionate belief is the way that you turn that around is through delivery. It's about saying, this is government's job. Our job is to create systems for the British public to improve their quality of life, whether it's the pound in the pocket or access to public services. Our job is to make that work better. And you can hold us to account in 5 years on whether or not we've delivered on that. And we have to tell a story about it, which is about saying we're doing this because we're putting the national interest above everything else, and judge us on our record.
But isn't there a question about potentially over-delivering here? Because when Keir Starmer was talking about the changes to the NHS app today, he talked about changes that will come in by spring 2025. But then you dig into the actual NHS England documents and they say, no, the app won't be all bells and whistles until 2027. So isn't there a danger that you're kind of promising stuff and then delivering it quite late? And that kind of reminds me about the announcement about the Social Care Commission on Friday, that actually we won't get the final report of that and the recommendations from that until 2028.
You know, cynicism is boosted by making promises that you don't keep. I agree with that, but I think we have a set of carefully thought out plans.
Well, not on social care,
might not be the most on electives, not the most glamorous things in the world. It's the nuts and bolts, the nitty gritty of what I would call good government. On adult social care, actually, when you look at what we've done since July the 4th, you know, an £86 million uplift to the disabled facilities grant, the biggest uplift to unpaid carers since the 1970s, legislated for a fair pay agreement for adult social care workers, the first time in history. You know, there's been a lot of work done in terms of those practical measures to get things started. So we're not just saying, let's just put everything on ice until we've got the commission up and running. But like all good reform, it requires a mixture of short-term immediate actions and long-term fixing the foundations, rewiring the system. And you have to be able to do both of those things at the same time. But the Casey Commission is going to happen because we've also recognised that you've got to have cross-party consensus on these issues. We need to learn the lessons of Andy Burnham in 2009, getting shot down, you know, with the death tax from the Tories, what we did to Theresa May in 2017, called it the dementia tax, torpedoed the whole thing. You know, it's every reform attempt on adult social care has failed for that reason. So we're going to build that cross-party consensus, and we're going to have reforms that are actually sustainable and are going to fix the foundations.
2028 could be the election year, couldn't it? And if it isn't, it won't be far off. In other words, you could get swept up into that whole thing that Theresa May encountered, that Andy Burnham encountered, that it all gets politicised again and nothing happens.
Well, the way that Louise clearly is going to work is by engaging on a cross-party basis and bringing proposals to the table and getting people aligned and engaged around those proposals. We know when it comes to funding, it's the fundamental question is what's the balance between what the state should contribute financially, what the family should contribute financially, and what the individual should contribute financially. That is a balanced and nuanced point, a price point, if you like, that you have to reach. It requires in-depth strategic discussion, and then it requires the parties to sign up to it so it doesn't get weaponized in the general election. Now, I hope that parties will engage in good faith. They will put country before party, and they will say, yeah, we sign up to that. Now, when the general election is called, it's up to them. I think it would be deeply disappointing to pretty much every person in this country if, having been engaged in these conversations, they all start then taking their bat and ball home. Yeah, but that's not going to be acceptable.
I thought the political consensus around paying for social care was what Dilnot suggested in 2011, which is and what was put in place by Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, but not yet implemented, which was the cap on the lifetime amount any single person would have to pay, and an improved means test so that more people got state-supported care. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, was the person that ripped that up because she said it was unaffordable. So does that mean that that's gone now? That we shouldn't think that that's what the Casey Commission could recommend? That's no longer the political consensus?
Well, I think the fundamental problem was with that as well, with Dilnot, was that when we came into government on the 4th of July, we discovered that absolutely no preparation had been done with local government. I mean, adult social care is channeled through local authorities. It's actually a joint lead really with the Department for Health and Social Care and the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, and you can't deliver anything like the changes that Dilnot was proposing without seriously getting local authorities geared up to make it happen, to look at the funding structure, to engineer it so that it works and that it's sustainable. None of that work had been done. So when we came into government and looked under the hood of the car, we saw that you couldn't make it work. So it was at that point we said, look, it's best to now look at Dilnot. Absolutely, Dilnot will be one of the models on the table that Louise will be exploring alongside a number of other models for funding it. We'll also be looking at international experience and putting all of that into the mix and getting the machine ready to deliver what it is we decide to do is also a really important part of this. So I think Dilnot, Andrew Dilnot did a really good job. He had a certain terms of reference, but unfortunately he was in many ways making proposals in a vacuum.
But how will you feel if we get to 2028 and the conclusion of Louise Casey's work is we should have a cap and an improved means test, which had first been suggested 17 years previously?
Well, look,
that would have been 17 wasted years, wouldn't it? Nearly 2 decades.
Look, we had successive Conservative governments over the last 14 years have sadly failed to take a lot of big decisions that needed to be taken on a whole range of issues. I think it's important not to sort of look in the rearview mirror. Let's look through that windscreen and actually move forward, and that is what we're doing. And if we can get to a point, imagine we get to a point where there's a genuine consensus around how we fix this fundamental issue. And you know what? Some of it's also very strategic. It's not just about the funding. It's also about changing the whole model so that it's not just about adding years to people's lives. It's adding life to their years so that we've got older people who are more active in the community, perhaps working a little bit longer, perhaps playing a more active role in looking after younger generations in their families, keeping people engaged, because we're sitting on a demographic time bomb. And yes, the funding and the coping and the absorbing of this issue of the changes in our society is going to be important, but they're also, that's in a sense dealing with the symptoms of the issue, rather than actually going to the fundamental question about lifestyle and the kind of lives that we're all going to need to live and the planning that we're going to need to do for how we live in an ageing society.
Given all of this prevarication that has gone on for years and years and years under multiple governments of multiple political complexion, talk to our newscaster listening who thinks, You guys have this colossal majority. You could have come in with a plan and implemented it and have it done and dusted by the middle of the Parliament with no threat that you get to 2028 and there's an election that's months away, and the whole story of social care and an imminent election plays all over again.
I think I'd say two things to that. One is getting it right is more important than doing it quickly. There's no point
Well, no one's accusing you of doing it too quickly. I mean, flipping heck.
Yeah, but you've got to think through the options that you have. And you've also got to get the machine of the state geared up and ready to make it happen.
People be shouting at their speakers, at their whatever their, however people are thinking, we've gone through this for so long.
Yeah, look, I mean, the second point I wanted to make is that it has been weaponized politically. It's been used as a political football.
By everyone.
Party political point scoring. Absolutely. There's no shortage of good ideas about what to do about this, but there's been a real shortage of good politics. So we are looking to...
So you're months after a general election that you've won in parliamentary seats terms by 1,000,000 miles. Now is the perfect time, arguably, to be able to say, get on with it.
We are getting on with a huge amount. I mean, I just rattled off a list of the things that we've done in the last 6 months. I'd argue that we've done more on adult social care in the last 6 months than what's happened in the last 14 years. There's a lot of operational changes that we can make. And imagine if we can start to get a fair pay agreement up and running that is actually going to deal with the biggest issue of all in the sector, apart from the funding issue, which is 131,000 vacancies. The system is on its knees. It needs immediate fixing. It needs immediate action, which is what we've been taking. I think that it's reasonable to say that whilst we're taking those immediate actions, we are also looking at the broader long-term issue of how you fund it. And the funding issue, I genuinely do believe, will not succeed unless it's based on a cross-party consensus, because you'll get to a general election and even we may have decided something and all the other parties will say, oh, well, we're going to rip that up. That's not the way we would do it. Or they'll call our system, our proposals, a dementia tax or a death tax, will come up with some other nifty soundbite and the whole thing will just kind of collapse in acrimony. So I think what we're trying to do is take that toxicity out of the debate and judge us on it when we get to the general election. I genuinely believe that we should and could be in a place where we've got party manifestos that are aligned and there's a consensus, and that would be a really exciting thing to take forward.
Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.